Hey everyone, I'm Matthew Vanderels, one of the community pastors at Founded in Truth Fellowship. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click that little bell to be notified whenever we post new content or go live every single week with our weekly church services. Also, feel free to comment below if you enjoyed this video or if you have any questions about this video. We would love to hear from you. So David, thank you for joining us. As you know, your last video of the Book of Enoch has become pretty popular. It's also generated quite a lot of questions online, so we thought it would be great to have you back to answer some of the most common questions that came up on the last video. The first question is, how do you know Enoch didn't actually write Enoch?
So I went into this a little bit in the first video, but I'd be happy to elaborate. There are features of the Book of Enoch that prove that these are much later writings. I'll just name a few. Number one, I already mentioned the book's use of much later biblical material from Daniel, Isaiah, and so forth. Those biblical books were obviously written much later than Enoch's time. Number two, we know that most of the book was likely originally written in Aramaic, which would fit more closely to the post-exilic period. If parts of 1st Enoch are from before this time, we would expect the text to have some sort of Akkadian or Sumerian cognates, or really any kind of indication of ancient culture, but there's no such evidence of this. Instead, the text reflects an Aramaic-speaking time period much later in history. Number three, the calendar outlined in the Book of Luminaries, which is the oldest section of 1st Enoch, it actually borrows elements from the Greek calendar as well as Greek arithmetic. Things like numerical symmetry, precision, and regularity, these are marks of Greek influence. This is unlike the biblical calendar in the Torah, which is obviously based on observation rather than precise calculation, like the new moon and the barley. So this would indicate that the oldest section of 1st Enoch wasn't composed until after the conquests of Alexander the Great. So those are just a few examples. There's really no reason to think the book could be earlier than post-exilic times, which is why scholars universally reject such a notion.
So a lot of people have asked why you have used the acronym BCE and CE instead of BC and AD. Would you like to comment on that?
I did notice while reading through the comments on the last video that a lot of people pointed that out, and I even had several people questioning my salvation over the fact that I used the quote-unquote wrong man-made reference terms for historical dates. So the biggest reason I used BCE and CE instead of BC and AD is that I'm not a heretic. There is no BC. There was never a time before Christ. Christ is eternal, right? Now, obviously, I'm joking. I don't have anything against BC and AD. I actually use those terms most of the time. I don't really have an answer for why I used BCE and CE for the Enoch video, except that it was probably because the scholars that I read on this topic use those terms most of the time. So those are the terms that my brain naturally used in the context of that discussion. But anyway, I didn't think it was a big deal, but apparently these things offend some people. So I learned my lesson. I'll make sure to use the right man-made reference terms from now on so that I don't cause anyone to sin by prejudging me on the basis of that.
David, can you elaborate on what you said about the patriarch Enoch being revealed as the messianic son of man in the Book of Enoch? Because a lot of people have asked about that.
Sure. This was a point that I made for why we don't consider the Book of Enoch scripture. It's one of several points, and that's because the Book of Enoch teaches a false Messiah, which is a pretty big deal to us as Christians. So in the last video, I talked about how the messianic figure that is seen throughout chapters 37 and 71 of the Book of Enoch, he fulfills all of these messianic prophecies in the world to come. He receives worship, he judges the world at the end of the age, he sits on God's throne, and all of these prophecies that we know apply to Yeshua. Well, it's for these reasons that many people on the internet, they actually get excited about the Book of Enoch because they see these prophecies as actually being about Yeshua. And so people will be like, oh, this book is foreshadowing Yeshua. It's prophesying about Jesus. The problem is that the author of this section of 1st Enoch directly tells us who he thinks this figure is, who he thinks the Messiah is, who these prophecies are all about. And it's not Yeshua, it's not Jesus, it's Enoch. Let's look at the passage. Let me pull it up on my phone here. And the head of days, this comes from 1st Enoch 71, 13 through 14. And the head of days came with Michael and Raphael and Gabriel and Phanuel and thousands and tens of thousands of angels without number. And he came to me and greeted me with his voice and said to me, you are that Son of Man who was born for righteousness, and righteousness dwells on you, and the righteousness of the head of days will not forsake you. So right here, Enoch is greeted as the Son of Man figure that he had been seeing in his visions. That passage we just read comes from the Hermania translation. Now, I have an article on my website, davidwilber.com, where I go into much more detail on this. The article is titled, Who is the Son of Man in 1st Enoch 71:14, and there will be a link in the description below. But the reason there is some confusion about this passage is that most people are relying on a translation of Enoch that has been intentionally altered from what the Ethiopic text actually says. That translation is the R.H. Charles translation, which is an older and very popular translation. It's in the public domain, and so most people can find it online for free, and so that's what they read. But the R.H. Charles translation has the verse in the third person rather than the second person, so that this verse reads, quote, this is the Son of Man, instead of, quote, you are the Son of Man. So you see, obviously, that difference in translation has some pretty big implications concerning the identity of this messianic Son of Man figure. If Charles' translation is correct, then Enoch is not being revealed as this figure, but he's being directed to a separate figure called the Son of Man, a separate person called the Son of Man. The thing to know about that R.H. Charles version of this verse is that R.H. Charles amended the text in that verse. This is well known, it's not a question. He didn't properly translate it according to what it says, but according to what he thought it should say. Charles theorized that there was a lost passage revealing the Son of Man figure as someone other than Enoch. Then, based on this theory, he deliberately mistranslated the Ethiopic text to reflect a third-person rendering rather than what the text actually says. If you look at the R.H. Charles translation, there is actually a note he inserted between verses 13 and 14 of chapter 71 of 1st Enoch, where he presents his theory of a lost passage. The problem is that there is zero evidence to substantiate his theory. There's no evidence of this supposed lost passage, which is why scholars universally reject his translation of this passage. Listen to what the scholar Leslie Walk says about Charles' translation. He says, Charles' solution was to amend the text of 1st Enoch 71:14 to the third person instead of the second person. Thus, Charles read, "This is the Son of Man," rather than "You are the Son of Man." Then he made the necessary changes in the rest of the text to bring it into harmony with the third person rendering. He also suggested that a paragraph which revealed the identity of the Son of Man has been lost. But this extensive emendation has no surviving textual basis in any of the manuscripts, and for this reason is to be rejected. Also, the scholar John Collins has likewise criticized Charles' approach to this passage. Listen to what John Collins says. He says, the solution of Charles was to amend 71:14 to read, quote, "This is the Son of Man," and change, quote, "you" to quote him in the following verses. This procedure has no basis in the text and is clearly unacceptable. And also, listen to what T.W. Manson says about Charles' emendation of this passage. He says, "Here we abandon Charles, who has rewritten the rest of the passage in accordance with his view of what Enoch ought to have said." So again, I go into much more detail on this in my article, but R.H. Charles' mistranslation of this passage is a big source for the confusion. If we just take the text for what it says, there's no question that Enoch is the one being revealed as this messianic figure.
David, I know you talked a little about canonicity and how the Book of Enoch was never considered scripture. But a lot of people have asked about why the Book of Enoch appears in the Ethiopian canon. Can you comment on that for us?
Yeah, sure thing. What a lot of people don't realize is that the Ethiopian church has a much more fluid concept of canon than the rest of Christianity. Listen to what Roger Cowley writes. He says, the concept of canonicity is regarded more loosely than it is among most other churches. So as theologians and leaders who actually belong to the Ethiopian church will tell you, the concept of canon is not as rigid as it is everywhere else in Christianity. There's not even really a canon per se, but actually various lists of writings, and not all of these lists are the same. In fact, while some lists do include Enoch, others exclude it. Not only that, but apparently not all books included in these various lists hold the same level of authority. This can be compared to how the Apocrypha is viewed within Eastern Orthodoxy. It's part of the canon, but not really the same level of authority as the rest of Scripture. So it's way overly simplistic to claim that the Ethiopian canon includes the Book of Enoch, and then to use that as some sort of basis for considering the Book of Enoch inspired.
All right, thanks, David. Thank you so much for your time. And can you tell everyone how they can connect with you online?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was a real honor. People can get a hold of me on my website, davidwilber.com. I'm also on all the social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest. So I'm out there. Come and find me. I'd love to connect with you guys. And thanks again for having me on.
If you enjoyed this message, go ahead, give us a like. If you didn't, feel free to give us a dislike. Guys, please let us know what you thought in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified whenever we have new uploads or whenever we go live with our weekly live stream from our fellowship every Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Stay fit, stay founded in truth. We'll see you next time.